Forza Horizon 5 is out for PC and is looking like a quality release on all platforms. Today, in this video specifically covering the PC version, we have something special as Playground Games have been kind enough to send us exact Xbox Series X settings on PC, allowing us a unique insight into how the game is optimized on console, as well as giving us a honestly perfect guide for prescribing optimized settings. So in this video, you can expect comparisons to the Xbox Series X version and what PC configuration you will need to either equalize the Xbox Series X modes or to beat that Xbox Series X. But before I get into that, let's talk about some PC version basics. Forza Horizon 5 on PC is in many ways like its predecessor I covered 3 years ago, with some slight differences. One important thing that happens this time now is that before you load into the main game itself, you will be confronted with this screen with the percentage counting up to 100. This initial loading screen is to ensure that the game compiles all of its shaders for your graphics card and driver. This may be a bit long even on a super PC, but it's necessary to ensure smooth performance with little to no shader compilation stutters, and I view this as a positive. One thing I'm less than keen on seeing is the general menu and settings experience here. Firstly, a lot of settings require the game to be restarted on changing or require minor shader recompilations. And I find this rather a shame, as this will disincentivize people from changing settings to optimize their performance, and it's a really big hassle, honestly. Dynamic resolution, which is used on Xbox Series X in its performance mode, is also missing in the PC version. Instead, there's a resolution scaler option, which just does flat resolution scales, and it's oddly named, almost like it was AMD's FSR. Here, ultra quality mode looks to be 76.6 repeating percent of the axis resolution, quality is 67%, balance is 60%, and performance is 50% axis resolution. At 4K output, this means 1656p, 1440p, 1296p, and performance just being 1080p. Now, there is no form of reconstruction in this game like TAAU, DLSS, or XESS, so this scaler is honestly rather marginally useful. Similarly, missing are dynamic settings, like the variable quality settings we've seen in other Forza games on PC, and what Xbox Series X uses in its performance mode for the cube map generation. As you can see, I find the options good in terms of what they have on offer here for the most part, but the way they function and how they do not go far enough in some directions makes this PC version not as special as it could have been. But what I really do like is the inclusion of a benchmark here, which is a perfectly repeatable sequence with a great after-action report. And best of all, this benchmark, from what I've seen, is highly representative of a high-stress area in the game, especially on the CPU side of things, so it is a great way to judge your worst-case performance in-game. This is a nice benchmark. Beyond that, there are some other gotchas here. You've probably already noticed it somewhat in this video, but your mouse cursor will show up on screen at all times in this game, even while driving and using something like a controller or a wheel. This is rather awkward, and you have to actually manually move the mouse to the side of the screen so it doesn't show up. And this seems like an oversight. The last thing to watch out for is how generally this game scales with resolution. Take a look at the game running at 720p on the left-hand side here and 1080p on the right-hand side. In most games, we expect the resolution to be the only differentiating factor between the quality of the graphics when the graphical settings are the same. In Forza Horizon 5, the level of detail for geometry and draw distance for objects is affected negatively by lower resolutions. So the game at lower resolution also seems to have a lower LOD. This makes sense on a technical level, as higher res definitely requires higher level of details for geometry and textures, but it means CPU performance in this game will scale with internal resolution. So the game running at 720p is going to be less CPU intensive than the game running at 1440p or 4K. As an example, here's the game running at 1080p, 1440p, 720p, and 540p respectively on two very different CPUs, the 10900K on the high end and a very mid-range Ryzen R5 3600. Here the settings are set to max CPU related options, but I turned down some GPU related ones to reduce the chance of being GPU limited. As we can see, the resolution behavior I talked about is showing here, where higher resolutions run worse, even though we're definitely CPU bound here, especially on that Ryzen R5 3600. Important to note is the performance in general here though. A mid-range CPU like the 3600 is good enough for 60 FPS even when those CPU related settings are maxed out. So it's going to be easy to match Xbox Series X's 60 FPS on mid-range CPUs. 120 FPS though is a bit harder to do, as we can see at the 10900K here, which even at 1080p at max CPU related settings is not always reaching 120 FPS. So those of you looking for 120 FPS or higher in the busiest sections of Forza Horizon 5, like this benchmark shows, may have to turn down some CPU related settings, but a bit more on that later in the video. One thing that I was slightly surprised to see regarding general performance was how CPU bound the loading appears to be, and perhaps single threaded? Here we can see how, all things being equal, the 10900K manages to load the fastest, while the 3600 and 5950X trade blows with that Xbox Series X. If the game was limited by transfer rate or how threaded it was, I would expect the 5950X here to definitely be on top. With that general information out of the way, let us get into the core of this video, that is Xbox Series X compared to PC and the performance implications thereof. Here, Xbox Series X quality settings on PC, which on Xbox targets 4K native with no dynamic res and 30 FPS. Well, now if you look here, there are some things that are easy to notice, namely that most of the settings are closest to the highest that the game offers. Important to point out though is that I have had to change a few of these settings here in the list from those that Playground sent to me, namely texture, resolution, and environmental quality, due to the way the game changed on release, and what the settings do appear to have changed a tiny bit. Given how close these settings are to the highest possible in the game, the actual graphical advantages one can achieve on PC are a bit limited. The most noticeable difference is in image quality. On PC, as we can see here, the MSAA level is set to 8x with FXAA on as well, and this definitely helps smooth out edges, as we can see here on this grill, keeping the image more stable than found on Xbox. And I think it's rather noticeable and especially relevant for small details like this. The other noticeable differences on PC high settings would be the increase in nearly all post-processing quality due to the shader quality option being higher, the most obvious of which is the smaller screen space shadows difference on Series X and PC. On PC, if you look up close, that screen space shadow there definitely has less aliasing. Other aspects of the image are changed, like the volumetrics, but the visual win is very low due to the filtering and how generally fleeting these are on screen when they are there. The last aspects that are improved are screen space ambient occlusion and SSR and distant car detail, and these aspects are visible definitely when you look, but in the actual gameplay of the game itself are practically invisible due to the speed of the actual gameplay interactions. One discrepancy in the Series X quality settings on PC is that night shadows are set to on in the settings, yet on Series X these night shadows from car headlights are turned off for races, but maintained as on in the open world. In PC, when set to on, they are forced on at all times, which keeps those shadows on during the races at the cost of performance. As you can see, that's about it. The differences on PC are not too huge, and will largely come down to performance being better on PC with the proper machine. I find this a bit of a shame, as there are a number of areas of the graphical presentation that could have been better on PC. Crowds, for example, on PC run at 30 FPS, just like they do on Series X. Surely they could have had an option to make that run at full frame rate. Image quality on PC is good, but to actually have it look great and rather pristine, that requires around 8 times MSAA to my eye to cover most of the jaggies in a thorough way. But even then, vegetation and shiny surfaces seem more aliased than I have seen in other games, even with 8x MSAA. And 8x MSAA is, as you can see here on a 3080 at 4K, prohibitively expensive. I would have liked to have seen something like TAA added as an option next to or in addition to MSAA. Then there's the fact that a number of graphical settings on PC do not seem to be functioning perhaps as intended. The first of which is world texture quality. Originally, Playground settings that they sent to me had Series X pegged at ultra texture quality, which is probably true, but ultra on PC looks to have an issue at the moment where no matter your memory amount, distant geometry has an ultra low resolution texture applied to it. Only setting the game to extreme fixes that. Similarly on PC, I believe the reflection quality setting is not working completely. In a number of scenes, its extreme setting looks similar to or slightly better than that found on Series X. In other scenes, the cube map reflection looks broken, like here where even on extreme, Series X is capturing more detail in its reflection, like the mountain in the background and the road close by, and also has, in my opinion, better filtering. A similar issue occurs with the game's MSAA, which at times in certain scenarios leaves bluish-white halos around vegetation, something that I do not see to the same degree on Series X. And lastly, there's ray tracing. This would have been an obvious win for PC, as at the moment it's limited to the garage and Forza Vista, where the game only ray traces against the car. So the car gets great self-reflections, but any object that is not the car is covered by using the game's real-time cube maps. This is a smart optimization for a car game, but it's limited on PC like it is on Xbox. Surely there is enough GPU power on PC, especially on NVIDIA GPUs, to enable this simple ray tracing in gameplay. And in fact, incredibly awesome modders from DF's Discord community have been editing the game's EXE to even allow this ray tracing in gameplay and in photo mode. But there's so much here to cover regarding this mod from our Patreon supporter Frosty that I'm going to break out its coverage into a separate video talking about performance, the impact on visuals, and what we can maybe expect for ray tracing on Series X. Simply put, I think the game looks good on PC, but I wish there were some sensible ways to increase graphical quality even further than found on Xbox, and I wish that the settings were working more properly, especially the texture one, which I don't think is working correctly. Performance mode on Xbox Series X in comparison makes quite a few visible reductions below the higher settings on PC to increase the game's performance, but at the same time it keeps other options similar. Its difference, of course, on Xbox is that it targets 60 FPS with dynamic resolution, with 4K being the highest and 1600p being the lowest. Most obvious changes are the reduction in trackside density in the world through the environmental geometry setting, which is especially visible in the jungle-like areas. There's also the shadow setting going from extreme to ultra, which gets rid of penumbra soft shadows, which look really great, but as you can see on PC, they have a clear performance cost. So those are the differences. As I see it, these Xbox settings are great on PC. That is because the developers behind this game purposefully chose the settings on Series X below the highest settings for very good reasons. Like any console developers, they wanted to maximize certain image quality aspects, or cut those aspects that are just too heavy for certain performance targets, like 60 FPS. As you can see here in this test, on an RTX 2060 Super, each of the Xbox settings is increasing performance by leaps and bounds above the absolute max settings. Quality settings on average by around 22%, and performance settings on average by around 53% on this GPU in this benchmark. Essentially, these graphical settings on Xbox do exactly what I look to do always in my optimized settings videos. They cut corners in those sensible areas and where the greatest wins can be made. For example, both use 4x MSAA, which, as I showed off in the video earlier, is definitely the sweet spot for image quality and performance returns, as 8x MSAA is too expensive. And this applies to the other cuts there as well, like for SSR and SSAO quality. Based upon my tests, these are great for optimized settings. I will use both of these mode settings as bases for multiple optimized settings, where what you will use will depend upon your preference in frame rate and resolution. To demonstrate which settings for which GPUs at which frame rates, let us pit PC against Xbox Series X. First, in performance mode. Normally, judging this would be impossible due to Series X having dynamic resolution, which is bizarrely missing from the PC version. But I have a trick up my sleeve. In the punishing jungle stage, it is possible to find an area where performance slips below 60 on Series X, and resolution there is easily countable. As the car goes off this ramp here in Series X performance mode, the game is running at native 4K. As it goes down toward the water, the frame rate drops as it cannot hold at native 4K, and it needs to drop to 1600p to climb up back to 60 FPS in that moment. If you think about it, to be better than this on PC, we would need a GPU that is above 60 FPS when it's at 4K in the air here on the ramp, but also above 60 FPS when the water is hit. Doing the test here with 3 NVIDIA GPUs I have available to me, it's easy to see how the RTX 2060 Super is quite a bit below 60 FPS at 4K no matter what the settings are. But the RTX 2070 Super is right on the line, honestly, with 60 FPS. With dynamic res, which is missing on PC, it could definitely be there. The 2080 Ti is just flying here with no problems, quite high above. As the ramp is hit, we can see the 2070 Super is below 60 FPS, indicating it is performing below Series X at this moment. As the water is hit, the 2080 Ti drops, but not below 60 FPS, importantly. It's maintaining above 60 FPS at native 4K in an area where the Series X needs to drop drop to 1600p to maintain 60. Based on that performance, the GPU, which is most similar to the Series X in performance mode here, would be between a 2070 Super, which would maintain 60 FPS in the air, but would be still a good deal below the 2080 Ti, which is above 60 FPS when the water is hit, while running at nearly 2 times the total resolution of the Series X in that moment. To me, that sounds like an RTX 2080 or RTX 2080 Super, a GPU I sadly do not have in my collection to test against. Now let us demonstrate more of this in quality mode. Managing to be similar to quality mode on PC requires less GPU grunt due to 30 FPS. As you can see here in that punishing jungle stage, the 2060 Super, where I purposely turned on VSync to show areas dipping below 30 FPS, well, this GPU is managing right there on that cusp of 30 in that brutal moment when the water is hit after the jump. So being equal to or better than the Series X here is not too hard, but the really interesting thing to look into is what GPU is required to double that performance, getting closer to that locked 60 FPS. Here, running an AMD RX 6800 XT with a factory overclock versus a Founders Edition 3080, we can see that doubling the Series X performance in one of the worst general gameplay moments is not easy. Here the 3080 is right on the cusp of 60 FPS, where the RX 6800 XT manages to be around 10% faster than that 3080. Both manage to be 60 when the water is hit, so doubling that Series X performance with quality settings requires at least a 3080 or 6800 XT. Based on these tests, my recommendations are as follows. For performance mode, I recommend an RTX 2080 Ti or 3070 tier or above for 4K and 60 FPS. For 1440p at 60 FPS, an RTX 2060 Super or above. For 1440p at 120 FPS, an RTX 3080 or above. For 1080p at 120 FPS, a 2080 Ti or 3070 or above. For quality mode, 1080p 60 is an RTX 2060 Super or above. For 1440p 60, an RTX 2080 Ti or above. For 4K 30, an RTX 2060 Super or above. And for 4K 60, an RTX 3080 or above. 1080p 120 here is going to require something like a 3080 or higher, but skewing towards higher end GPUs like the 3080 Ti or 6900 XT for the hardest of locks. CPU-wise, 60 FPS is even good on a Ryzen R5 3600, and 120 FPS or higher is going to require something like a 10900K in performance mode, and something even better than that in quality mode. Getting to the end of this video here, there are a few things I would like to mention still. Even though I concentrated on the Nvidia range earlier, just to simplify things a bit, you should know that the RX 5700 performs nearly identical to the RTX 2060 Super. It's actually performing eerily similar to that RTX 2060 Super, so that scaling we saw between the Turing family of chips there can be applied in a similar manner to RDNA chips. Speaking of RDNA, I did notice a bit of weirdness when doing all of my recordings on the 6800 XT. It did exemplary, mind you, but it had some frame time issues that I was not getting there on the 5700 or on any of the Nvidia GPUs. Similarly strange was how opening up the menus on that GPU or changing cars in the garage incurred really long wait times and pauses that I was not seeing elsewhere. So perhaps there's still some growing pains here on the game or driver side. Coming to a conclusion about the game in general, I think it is a good one on PC, but I really wish we had more choice in the options for things like dynamic res, dynamic settings, better looking crowds, and so on and so forth. And some of these things we actually already had in previous Forza games. Generally, I just think this game could have better embraced the strengths of the PC platform by adding in things like image reconstruction tech, such as DLSS or XESS, or by allowing ray tracing to be on during gameplay. As usual, modders though are here to the rescue, and I will cover gameplay ray tracing on PC in an upcoming video. But that is enough for me for now. If you did like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support DF on Patreon to access our content in high quality and gain access to our Discord, which, thanks to its incredible members, we were able to find out how to enable ray tracing on PC here. So thanks again, Frosty. If you want to talk to me about Forza on PC, well, write a comment below or follow me on Twitter. As always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.